let's talk about cholesterol.
Yeah.
So I learned a lot just from reading up on this stuff. And it seems like our knowledge of cholesterol and risk factors and all that stuff is actually changing more than I realized it was.
Yeah.
In my experience, I know cholesterol is bad. I know it gunks up your arteries, and you shouldn't eat cheeseburgers because that's how you get high cholesterol.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's the truth, right?
In part.
Partially. Okay.
Yeah.
What is going on? Tell us all about cholesterol.
Yeah. No, and just to kind of sum up what you said there, we're learning more and more about the, individual components of a cholesterol screening or blood cholesterol panel and the implications for the different types of particles and the size of the particles and things that, again, are modifiable and not necessarily modifiable. Sure. So it is, I guess that's more or less just a teaser to what's to come with a lot of this stuff. But yeah.
So what is cholesterol?
Yeah.
We'll start there.
Mm-hmm. So cholesterol is, chemically classified as a lipid. So the way to think about that is it's something that can't be dissolved in water. Okay. So you just think of the old oil and water example. Right. You try to put some olive oil in your water and it doesn't work. Or you're making salad dressing and you got to put the emulsifier in there. You put the mustard with the olive oil.
Oh yeah, it's good stuff.
The vinegar. See?
I might need some of that later.
For sure. That was the cooking lesson for the day.
We'll put that recipe down in the comments.
Yeah. So it's a lipid. It's a lipid. And it's important to mention that cholesterol plays many vital roles throughout the body. It's essential for cell structure, function, and the overall fluidity and malleability of the cell.
Okay.
And it's important for brain function. It's important for the production of hormones, as it's a precursor to things like vitamin D, our sex hormones, so testosterone, the estrogens, progesterone, and then also a precursor to cortisol, our body's stress hormone.
Okay.
So it's absolutely essential that it exists.
So there's a reason we have cholesterol. Mm-hmm. It's not like an invasive thing.
Yes.
It's part of your body.
Yes. And so that's
okay.
That's a lot of, where the confusion comes in. It's like, I have high cholesterol because I eat a diet that's high in cholesterol.
Right.
And for some people, they might eat such a high volume of high cholesterol containing foods that could have an issue.
Right.
But we'll see that's not typically the silver bullet as far as increasing our blood cholesterol levels.
Okay.
And even to go back to a little more of the basics here, every cell in the body is capable of producing cholesterol.
No kidding.
Yes.
Literally every cell.
Mm-hmm. And so because of this, due to the tight regulation of this process of this cholesterol production, we're not really relying on getting additional cholesterol from the diet. So my sense of it is, and my understanding, and maybe I'm kind of wrong here, but what you're eating and what you're consuming from your diet, let's say it is a little bit higher in cholesterol.
Sure.
Your cells, I suppose, are going to just kind of down-regulate the amounts that they need to produce, and vice versa. If you're somebody that's not eating a diet high in cholesterol, you are probably just up-regulating in a very complex way to make sure that your cells have enough cholesterol to function. Your sex hormones have enough cholesterol to function. So it's a lot of this is just so much bigger than the dietary cholesterol component. We're talking about physiologic, endogenous cholesterol in the body.
Yeah.
We're going to kind of ignore, just to keep things moving, we're going to maybe ignore a lot of the dietary components of cholesterol containing foods.
Because I remember when I was a kid, I was told that I had high cholesterol. I say a kid, I was like 10 and they tested my blood and they said, you got high cholesterol, no more McDonald's.
Yeah.
Which was probably a good choice ultimately. But we are not talking about dietary cholesterol for the most part, because that is not the most effective way to manipulate our levels.
Yes, if you're in this case, you are looking to lower LDL cholesterol, you're looking to lower total cholesterol. It's not the best route to do so.
Okay.
Again, it's not that it has no effect, but again, there's something much deeper in our biology that's occurring. As far as what the cells are producing, what your intake is.
Right.
And we talk about cells specifically, a majority of this production is coming from the liver. So there's just there's a feedback process that's occurring, and for some, it eventually becomes dysregulated. But again, in a perfect world,
right?
You know,
got it. Okay, so So every cell in the body needs cholesterol. Every
Yeah.
cell in the body is capable of producing cholesterol. Cholesterol is a precursor to hormones.
Yep.
It's used for, you said, the brain health, and it's used for all kinds of things. Cell structure, literally the physical makeup of the cell, needs cholesterol. Okay, so even if we eat it or whatever, it's getting transported through the body. Is that presumably happening in the bloodstream? Is that what's going on?
Yes, and the digestive part of how we break down cholesterol is a little more complicated.
Sure.
I would say, and I would say we, more or less just give that the elementary treatment.
Sure.
Just say yes,
It's going through the
eat,
bloodstream.
What you eat just does less than what you would think potentially.
Okay. And when it goes through the bloodstream, you said it's a lipid.
Exactly.
And
I see.
the blood is not lipid. The blood is what? Water-based?
It's mainly water.
Okay.
You're looking at blood plasma, it's majority water.
Okay.
And so back to the oil and water example, that's the tie-in. So cholesterol would not be able to dissolve or move around properly, be transported throughout the body in the blood, specifically the blood vessels, without these certain vehicles that are known as lipoproteins. And so essentially the makeup of a lipoprotein, it's the fatty interior, and then there are proteins, there's a protein casing that is more hydrophilic or more water seeking, water tolerable or whatever. And so that those lipoproteins are ultimately what can transport and do things. And that's what we're measuring on different blood panels.
Okay. So let me make sure I'm getting this. So cholesterol itself is cholesterol. There's not different kinds of cholesterol. We talk about HDL and LDL. We're not actually talking about different kinds of cholesterol. We're talking about
Lipoproteins, yes.
Okay. So the lipoprotein is like the car that is transporting the cholesterol molecules through the bloodstream.
Yes.
And it works that way because the inside of it is a lipid. It's a lipolipid, and the protein portion on the outside is water soluble, and so it plays nice with the water and with the fat, holds it all together.
Yes.
Shoots it through the bloodstream.
Exactly. And so looking further at these lipoproteins, depending on the size or the type, that's where the difference in potential to adhere to or to just pass through the vessel walls. So when these proteins bump into the blood vessels or they have a way of sticking to the blood vessels, it depends specifically on the size and type. And so the cholesterol that's riding on that lipoprotein is what's, gets left behind.
Okay.
And so that gunk, like you mentioned, can start to build up over time. And eventually that gunk, they become plaques. And so they're inflamed. Okay. Essentially all plaques they're inflamed cholesterol deposits that are what can lead to the, atherogenesis, the atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, where we can see heart attack and stroke occur.
Okay. All right. This is blowing my mind a little bit. Okay. Because this really is changing the way I understand all of this and fleshing it out radically. So the cholesterol particles themselves are neither here nor there, or they're neither good nor bad. They're something your body needs. The lipoproteins are transporting them through the body. If it was just cholesterol in the bloodstream, because it won't mix with water, it would just stick where it is and we would die instantly.
Yeah, I assume if you were lacking carriers, I don't.
Yeah,
I guess
it just wouldn't function.
Yeah, right.
So they're wrapped up in the lipoproteins. There's different types and sizes of lipoproteins that determine whether or not they're the high density or the low density in terms of what it contains, and they have different risk factors, but the idea is the lipoproteins transported through the blood vessels, and sometimes due to whatever issue, the lipoprotein gets stuck in an artery, and when it does, it ejects its cholesterol and just is left there. Is that what's happening, and that's what turns into the plaque over time?
Essentially. So the other, the key part of, when we just briefly mentioned plaques, and you're right, is the fact that they're inflamed cholesterol deposits.
Okay.
So it's when these, and again, a lot of this is going to be the broad stroke version, the Spark Notes version, and we get that. The inflamed cholesterol deposits. So when this cholesterol is in high amounts, when these lipoproteins specifically are, like we talked about with persistently elevated blood pressure, persistently elevated blood glucose, with that, slightly subtly persistent elevation in blood cholesterol and these lipoproteins. It's just enough over time to begin to adhere depending on the particle. There's different particles that have a different, have an affinity for different things. And so when like you said, the cholesterol gets dumped and left behind, it's not just the cholesterol that's causing the problems, it's the inflammatory response, which is a whole topic in and of itself that begins to, decrease your endothelial function and breaks down essentially just disrupts the function of how your normal blood vessels would be otherwise working.
So it's a very, very complex process that's happening here. It's not just a simple matter of stop eating the cheeseburger necessarily. Like there's other things going on. Okay.
Yeah.
So tell me about, since lipoproteins seem to be the issue here, we've got different types.
Right.
High density, low density.
Yeah.
The high density, let's see if I remember this right. High density is the safer one. That's the good one. And it's smaller, which is thus the density, because you've got the same amount of cholesterol kind of packed into a smaller space. It's more dense. That's a good one, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, technically, yes. And so, let's just run through a standard blood cholesterol panel.
Okay.
HDL cholesterol is something that pops up on there.
Yes.
So a standard panel will just give you a snapshot of the cholesterol that's being, again, carried by these specific lipoproteins.
Okay.
And so we're not necessarily just looking at this nebulous, like there's this cholesterol. What you're really looking at is the lipo, you want to know what the lipoprotein, how many lipoproteins and the difference between the certain lipoproteins. So why do we even care about these? Again, because heart disease or ASCVD risk is not just related to the amount of cholesterol present, but also how long the cholesterol is elevated. So I do really want to keep harping on that point, because you're sitting at home wondering, why does my doctor want to treat me so aggressively? My risk is only this. Why does my doctor want to treat me so aggressively with this statin? My risk is only this. I'm only 42. Like what? He needs to get off my back. I'm trying to work out. I'm trying to do these things. These clinicians, they're parsing through the research and they're seeing that the quicker that you can make a difference, the better.
Right.
That's all. From there, looking at this standard panel, you'll see at the top typically total cholesterol.
Okay.
And so this is the total amount of cholesterol on all of the lipoproteins. Okay.
Okay.
And so keep in mind, like you mentioned, the cholesterol that all of these different lipoproteins are carrying, they're generally the same. So for all intents and purposes of this conversation, it's the same cholesterol, just different lipoproteins.
Okay.
And so technically, this is where the technicality that I think you were getting to, there's really no good or bad cholesterol in that sense. There's kind of just good or bad or differences in the characteristics of the lipoproteins themselves.
Okay.
I think that's...
Yeah, because everybody talks about good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. In a literal sense, that's not a thing.
Right. And I get it. It's it's a tongue-in-cheek. It's an easy way to just say it. And it's whatever.
We're going to say this the wrong thing too, invariably. If not now, then certainly in another video. Mm-hmm. But it's good lipoproteins and bad lipoproteins in a sense, not cholesterol itself.
Yep.
Okay. So HDL, LDL, you said there's total cholesterol.
So we looked at the total. Yes.
And then there's HDL and LDL.
Mm-hmm. Looking further at the total cholesterol. So in a broad sense, those with lower densities are more atherogenic. And so when we say atherogenic, we just mean that they're more, you just think of that as like a bad term. It's more likely to cause the atherosclerosis. It's just the
athero isn't really associated with any good.
In this case.
Yeah.
In this case. Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
So the thing is, the particles that are more atherogenic, they can more easily infiltrate the vessel walls and then leave behind the cholesterol that they're carrying. And so that's like the last sort of broad stroke that I think we need to, talk about. And so you mentioned HDL cholesterol, or HDL-C on your, blood work. This is the amount of cholesterol being carried on the high density lipoprotein specifically. Good.
Right.
Routine of making the distinction, get in the routine. Higher-ish concentrations of HDL cholesterol, they are associated with a decrease in ASCVD. It's not a causal relationship, and we know this because we've tried different medications that have the potential to raise HDL, and from an outcome perspective, they're not doing as much as we maybe thought.
Right.
So there's an association, but we're not, I think at this stage of the game, again, I'm not a PCP, I'm not a cardiologist, but from what I'm seeing and reading and listening to, they, you're not typically seeing treatment to raise HDL. You're
Right.
more worried about lowering the other stuff that we'll get to.
Okay, so HDL is good, but it's
Mhm.
not you want it higher, but it's not something that you're necessarily going to be taking a medication
Right.
or taking extreme measures to raise your HDL.
Mhm.
Conversely, the LDL, that is something we're going to take action on.
Right. And so even just looking at the structure real quick too, in the densities,
Yeah.
looking at the structure of HDL, the HDL particle, it's a relatively smaller lipoprotein, but it's in a lower concentration, and it seemingly serves the function of removing fats and removing the cholesterol away from the cells and back to the liver for excretion. So I suppose that's why it's been given the good
Because it's taking
tag. Yeah.
so HDL lipoprotein is literally taking unneeded cholesterol out of the body.
Basically, it plays more of that role.
Okay.
I want to say, and I'm eager to learn more about that. There's
Right.
no doubt. Now we can start. This is where things with the nomenclature can even get a little more complicated.
Yeah.
So we'll do our best. So, in addition to this being HDL cholesterol, HDLC, these lipoproteins specifically carry a surface protein known as ApoA. And so we don't need to go down the rabbit hole there, but you might hear it, you might read it, you might see it. It's ApoA, and you'll see why we're emphasizing the capital A.
Yeah.
Because there's little A's and big A's and this and little B's and big B's.
Yep.
It's just that's the distinguishing characteristic in addition to its density of the HDL lipoprotein is this presence of an ApoA. And so I think there's a lot of research to be done there, just more or less for distinguishing different things.
Sure.
So now we'll go to LDL cholesterol, or the low density lipoprotein cholesterol, LDLC. This is the amount of cholesterol being carried on the LDL specifically. This one has an affinity for kind of getting into those arterial or venous walls. So this is where we term it the bad. This is where you've seen bad cholesterol.
Yes.
Triglycerides also pop up on your standard blood cholesterol panel. It's another form of fat specifically that's being carried on lipoproteins.
Okay.
Now, triglycerides are being transported around and used for energy. You burn triglycerides just moving around, like it's just part of metabolism.
Okay.
The biggest thing here, and we're not going to maybe focus a ton on triglycerides. It's not that they're not important; they are.
Right.
But when they're elevated, they carry their own separate risk, basically, for heart disease, nebulously speaking.
Wow.
So, and there's dietary inputs, there's alcohol inputs, there's the link of hyperinsulinemia. It's just a prime example where we could pull in 50 different things here.
Yeah.
We mentioned this already, but non-HDL cholesterol is a calculation that will pop up on the cholesterol panel as well.
Non-HDL cholesterol.
Non-HDL cholesterol.
So you get your total cholesterol number, and then you just subtract your HDL cholesterol, and that's your non-HDL cholesterol estimated number?
Exactly.
Okay.
And so you're probably wondering, like, well, wouldn't this just give us LDL? What else is in there?
Right.
And so basically, this is where things break down a little further. There are ultra low density lipoproteins. There are very low density lipoproteins. There are intermediate density lipoproteins.
Oh,
and
wow.
so I suppose that it's, when you're looking at non-HDL, it's a better reflection of those atherogenic lipoproteins. You're getting a better snapshot than just looking at LDL-C.
I was going to say, is the very low, the ultra low, are those even more atherogenic than your standard LDL?
I believe that they do have the potential to be.
Right.
I don't know exactly,
Okay.
to be honest. Yeah, I would have to see.
Yeah.
I think it's just more of the conglomerate of those lower density, lipoproteins that you're worried about. And again, this is a good example of something being tied back directly to outcomes. So we can just say that looking at non-HDL there's just a better, getting this under control just gives us we're more confident in saying that we can reduce risk of these events if you just get the non-HDL cholesterol under control.
Okay.
You know what I mean? I
Yep.
think
absolutely.
that's a good way to put it.
And that's a really good point. Our goal is to help people live better longer.
Yes.
So this isn't about hitting a number just because you want to say you hit a number.
What did it mean?
The whole point is to reduce your risk of atherogenic cardiac events.
Yep.
Got it.
Yep.
Yeah.
But I think you're going to see, I think the next logical step here is ApoB. And that's
Okay.
where I think you're going to see some of, maybe you have a different conversation with your doctor, or you see something on TV, in the newspaper, whatever, talking more specifically about ApoB.
Okay.
This, just like we talked about ApoA.
Yep.
So ApoA was the one on the HDL
Right.
lipoprotein. This is the protein that's on the LDL, all of the LDL,
All of
species.
the non-HDL.
Exactly.
All the LDL versions.
And so you can test either the concentration of these particles. You can test the number of these particles.
Yeah.
And from those, just based on listening and reading from those that know much more than I do about this, I think it's even preferred, if you can, to try and get a measurement of the number of particles that are present. I think this just can help. This is just, again, it's something that they're better able to predict your risk if you have that information.
Got it.
I'm not the one treating you, but I think if you go in equipped with this knowledge, you can understand it better when you're dealing, hashing it out with your doctor.
Okay, so ApoB, big B,
Yeah.
and that's the protein on the outside of the LDL particles, all varieties.
Yeah.
Okay.
I want to get to while we're talking about BBA,
Yeah.
I want to get to LP little a.
Okay.
But before we get there,
Yes.
let's just talk about what can cause the changes in the stuff we just talked about.
Okay.
All right.
Sure.
So again, we're dealing with biomarkers. We're not just changing the number for the sake of changing the number. We want outcomes. So how does this happen? There's genetic causes that can cause abnormalities. There's familial hypercholesterolemia.
Yep.
Which there's a threshold of LDL cholesterol that they'll look at that might lead them to believe you have that gene. So something that, again, but you're better off knowing that sooner than later.
Yeah.
There are even elevations that are like genetically related that are more subtle than this familial hypercholesterolemia. So
Okay.
I mean, your example, you had persistently elevated cholesterol when
I
you were a
do.
child.
It's my family. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe you didn't have the FH gene, or maybe you did and it was just a little more subtle, and like your levels weren't 200 or whatever.
Right.
So that's again, the genetic stuff, man. It's interesting, but it's not my bag.
Well, and there's not a lot you can do about it.
Yeah.
Other than to
Just
know
treat
it
early.
so that you can take action on other things.
Yeah. And then also we look at dietary causes. This is what can be a little controversial for some people. But we're not looking at dietary cholesterol. We're looking at specific fat sources.
Okay. So you're not talking about reducing cholesterol in your diet.
Yep.
You're talking about all the other things
Yep.
that affect the way your body deals with cholesterol?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And so
Hit me.
So specifically, there's good evidence to say that replacing high amounts, like super high intakes of saturated fat, replacing that with unsaturated fat sources can decrease your risk of ASCVD.
Okay.
Okay.
Saturated fat is the solid kind,
Pretty much.
like the fat that's on a steak or the fat that's whatever at room temperature, it remains solid, versus unsaturated fats tend to be like nuts and seed oils, and not seed oils. That's a bad thing, but
and even, man, I mean, we could definitely maybe break some of that down further in another setting as well.
Sure. I'm just trying to make sure I understand what we're talking about.
For sure. And even just from the, organic chemistry perspective, it's just, when you're talking about saturated, unsaturated, trans fats, you're talking about the placement of these double bonds.
Okay.
In the way that the carbon atoms and the hydrogen atoms are situated. So that when we're talking about just why they're named what they are, that's where that comes from.
Okay.
And again, but then there are, in addition to those, the organic molecule, there are physical properties then that also are different.
Obviously, and because they have a different effect on the body.
Yes.
Okay, so you were saying reduce saturated and increase unsaturated.
Yes, it's all about what you replace it with.
Okay.
So there's a lot of this gets lost in the weeds. Well, I'm just going to reduce saturated fat because they told me to, but then you're not replacing it with whole foods. You're not replacing it with, not the store, but you're not replacing it with minimally processed foods. You're replacing it with cereals and white breads and refined sugars and stuff that, causes, a whole host of other issues. Or there are even, there's the whole argument that not all saturated fats are created equally.
Sure.
So instead of demonizing one nutrient, that's not what we're trying to do. It's that we know for sure that if you're eating exorbitant amounts of saturated fat, watch that.
Right.
You know what I mean? At least know maybe what your blood work looks like. Whatever. Or your family history, all this kind of stuff. Also, if you are somebody who prefers higher saturated fats, you like your red meat, you like chicken, whatever, you need to make sure that your dietary pattern is high in fiber. A dietary pattern that's low in fiber, we see this increased risk of ASCVD and high cholesterol.
Okay.
So huge. And so instead of fixating on a number, ideally you want to be above 30 grams a day of fiber. But instead of fixating on the number, by just increasing the amount of minimally processed foods, that right there alone is probably going to push you above 30. So eating above 30 will help reduce your cholesterol. That's massive.
Okay. So you just again to kind of rehash here and simplify. You're saying if we need to bring down cholesterol, one of the things we can do is reduce saturated fats, those being especially in highly processed foods. So like hard sausage or something like that where it's been processed maybe with nitrates and whatever else.
Yeah, salt, tons of salt.
Yeah, you're reducing that, but you're not replacing it with Twinkies and Ho-Hos. You're replacing it with chicken or fresh red meat or something like that, where it's still saturated fat, along with high amounts of fiber.
Yep.
If you're going to eat a high saturated fat, you must have high amount of fiber.
Yep. And the unsaturated sources are huge. More salmon, more nuts, more avocado. Just to piggyback a couple ideas there.
Okay.
So, and then also there are even studies showing that there are certain dairy saturated fats that have that are less likely to cause these atherogenic particles to accumulate. So the point is there are multiple types of saturated fats, and I think we'll get to that one day.
Yeah.
But the point is there's a little more to this than just slapping blanket labels on.
Yeah,
things.
it's nuanced.
So for sure.
Okay.
So the other couple things would be just a couple other lifestyle factors. So we talked about carrying excess body fat in a variety of other contexts. You can measure your waist circumference, and then you can reference something on Google Images, or we can post something that will at least allow you to maybe know where your body fat percentage is without thinking you got to jump in the a special in-body scanner or something. And the point is, there are the way in which you accumulate body fat. A lot of times matters, and there's associative risk there with maybe where you're accumulating the body fat, the visceral adiposity that makes a difference as far as reducing risk. Smoking and nicotine is another huge one.
Okay.
Smoking in and of itself associated with lower HDL cholesterol and independently increases risk for heart disease.
Smoking is associated with lower HDL and increases heart disease.
Yep.
And strokes.
All of the
Since
above.
we talked about that. Yeah.
Yep.
So smoking's a real bad idea. You shouldn't do that.
Yeah. And so there are also medications that can increase your risk for, elevated cholesterol levels.
Oh,
there are certain beta blockers that can increase LDL and lower HDL cholesterol. Those maybe you want to talk to your pharmacist about.
So just make sure that if you're on multiple drugs that you're
sure.
And this is a risk factor for you. You need to make sure that everybody's aware of what's going on.
Sure. And a lot of times in these, metabolic syndrome instances, they will already might already be being treated for, hypercholesterolemia or whatever.
Right.
Dyslipidemia. Another one, anabolic steroids. We know for sure this can cause a marked increase in LDL cholesterol, and also decrease your HDL cholesterol. There are certain immunosuppressants. If you've had a kidney transplant, liver transplant, those medications have an impact. But again, we're not telling you to stop these meds. We're just being obviously for the sake of completeness. And Joey mentioned, shout out Joey. He mentioned, we were talking about thyroid. Thyroid hormones, they play a role in cholesterol homeostasis. So ultimately, it may influence the amount of cholesterol that is secreted in the bile. So all of that's to say, if you don't know you have hypothyroid and you have not treated it and you're not being treated, your cholesterol could be elevated partially because of that. So addressing the hypothyroidism can help, get your cholesterol into a better range. But
just another thing to look
out for.
Got it.
Yeah.
All right.
So finally, and this is not going to be a part of your standard lipid panel, and that's what we've built this conversation around. This is something that you might want to ask your provider about, and you'll see why.
Yeah.
This is lipoprotein little a.
Okay.
LP little a. So it's not that this is necessarily new.
That's the one when it's written out, it's LP and then like parenthesis.
Exactly.
Little a.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. And so while not new per se, it's another specific lipoprotein. It's a subset of LDL. It's another lipoprotein being linked independently to atherosclerosis and related diseases. So most notably, and I learned this from the barbell medicine guys, the European Atherosclerosis Society released a consensus statement regarding the LP little a,
Mm-hmm.
and ASCVD and aortic stenosis. So all of that's to say, there's big overarching body of very smart people who create guidelines, and they look at different treatments and different
This is
causes.
all they do. They look at
This is what
cholesterol.
they do, and they don't come out with consensus statements every 2 weeks.
Right.
You know, consensus statement is something that they've built over time.
Yeah.
And they're not just going to come out and say it until they know for sure that this is going to impact clinical practice.
Yeah.
So I think this is only a matter of time before it affects how, American physicians are practicing. In summary of this consensus statement, they feel that there's strong evidence for a causal association between LP little a concentration and cardiovascular outcomes in different ethnicities. So this association is continuous at low levels of low density lipoprotein cholesterol. So even if your LDL-C is low and your LPA is elevated, you're at an increased risk in and of itself just because of that part.
So typically for most people, it'll be corollary, like your LDL-C and your LP little a will track pretty closely together, but there are some people
there's divergence
that are divergent.
Yep.
And so even if your LDL-C is low, you still might have LP little a high, which means you're still at a high risk.
Right.
So you're saying the Europeans are saying this is something that needs to be tested for and looked out for because it can have serious ramifications, and it isn't automatically screened for.
It's not.
And just knowing your LDL-C number isn't going to tell you whether or not you've got high amount of LP little a.
Right. This is not, the reason I didn't mention it with the standard panels, because you have control over a lot of what is measured in that panel. Unfortunately, with intensified lifestyle modification and risk factor management and medication therapy, unfortunately, you don't have much control over this LP little a level.
Okay.
So that's the key fact. And so what stood out to me about this consensus statement is they also recommended that this specific lipoprotein should be measured at least once in adults. They're recommending just like broad scale screening of this molecule. And it's not really being done at all at this point from my limited purview of clinical
I've
treatment.
never had that number given to me.
Yeah. And so I think they're still grappling with a lot of what's happening. And there are different medications in phase 2 and 3 trials looking to try and lower this amount.
Okay.
But the point is, as we talked about non-modifiable risk factors, you don't really have much control over this.
Okay. So LP little a, it's a non-modifiable risk factor at the moment. It's genetic, I guess.
There is a specific gene.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, wow. So we know exactly which gene it is.
Yes. And they still, in this LP little a, it still contains an ApoB.
Wow.
So
okay.
It's an LDL. It's an
LDL particle. And that is an elevated risk factor that you cannot control at the moment. So if you have it, you can be tested at any point in time.
Yeah.
And they'll be able to tell you yes or no.
Pretty much.
And then based on that, how hard you might have to crank on every other element of your cholesterol to try and keep things safe.
Even mentioning LP little a, like rewind that part, listen to that part. Just because you can't control the LP little a right now, as much as you might want to, that doesn't mean you just stop pulling the levers or you stop addressing the things that you can't control as far as this holistic risk reduction approach.
Right.
So that's the name of the game.
Yeah.
I mean, we could have just basically said that.
Yeah, that's well said. So, okay. So what are risk reduction things that we can do other than, you said diet, and diet specifically, we're talking about reducing, you said saturated fats, increasing unsaturated fats,
increasing fiber intake,
and
doing whatever you need to do to maintain a healthy weight,
right,
out on excess body fat.
Reducing inflammation in general,
Yes,
since that's an element here.
that is. And a lot of that it's hard to have control over that specifically.
Right.
But there's ultimately ways. But yeah. The
Joey would be sure to tell us about red yeast rice.
For sure.
That's a supplement that helps.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely helps. Works in a statin-like manner. And then you know what? There was the other interesting part about Lp(a) too. We were talking about the gene. So and this is not to like end with a somber note, but by age 2, the Lpa gene is fully expressed. That's the gene that leads you to, let's say, have a high or low Lp(a).
Yeah.
By 2, you kind of know what it's going to be like. By age 5, Lp(a) is getting pretty close to its highest point that it'll ever be in your life.
Wow,
which is interesting.
Yeah, it doesn't change over time.
Yeah, it can become more increased in time, but I think that's why they're recommending screening kind of whenever. And it's just that it's not it's not going to change that much, so you just need to know it, and you don't have to keep remeasuring it because there's not this multitude of ways to really change it.
Okay, well
but
that's good. So no matter what, people can't ask for that when they're getting a cholesterol blood screening done. They can just say, "Hey, please run this as well."
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah. Well, I hate to be whatever, because potentially that's not something like maybe your insurance is going to cover at this time. You may have to pay an extra couple $100 for it. You may have to like twist an arm and a leg to get an explanation.
Your doctor might say,
like,
"I don't understand why you want that."
Yeah, and also
because this really is like kind of cutting edge. If they're just talking about it in Europe right now,
it is.
This is not widely known necessarily.
It is, and for those that I don't want to undersell this part of it, but your doctor might be thinking, okay, so I have this patient in front of me. We know their non-HDL cholesterol is elevated anyway. We know we may not really be able to do much with the Lp(a) at this moment in time. That just might be their way of saying, hey, like let's just address and focus on the things that we still can focus on.
Right.
It's not a disregard for the Lp(a).
Right.
But this is especially important for somebody who, man, like maybe you're like, my cholesterol's not that high.
Right.
I'm only 30 some.
Yeah.
But I am curious. My mom had a heart attack. My dad had this, or stroke risk, and you have all these things. This seems as though it's worth knowing.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things like over screening. This brings about that whole issue of like maybe over screening for certain things. And I'm getting the sense that this is not something that's being over screened.
Right.
And if it is something that can predict your risk of cardiovascular disease or high cholesterol independent of your non-HDL, then I assume this is going to just keep building in popularity and prevalence.
Makes sense.
So